Ukraine was a poor country before the war began, but its GDP slumped by 45% in 2022. Well over 100,000 residential buildings have been damaged or destroyed. 8 million Ukrainian refugees are now registered across Europe from a pre-invasion population of 44 million. A further 5 million at least are internally displaced. In October 2022, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal estimated the cost of rebuilding Ukraine as $750 billion. The OHCHR records 18,000 Ukrainian civilian casualties, including 7,000 deaths. In areas occupied by Russia, elected authorities have been replaced and Russia has ruled through terror. Murder, torture, disappearances, sexual assaults and widespread looting have been routine. Ukraine has opened over 50,000 case files on alleged war crimes. Putin's year of war has, so far, been a spectacular strategic failure. Western sanctions have not stopped the war, but they have damaged Russia's economy, which was already in poor shape before the invasion. Putin's apparent belief that Ukraine would quickly collapse as Russia invaded from Belarus in February 2022 was quickly disabused. The Russian state expected to take the Ukrainian capital Kiev within days and even believed Russian forces be welcomed. In fact, Russian troops faced strong resistance, were defeated and withdrew, redeploying in eastern Ukraine, where a second phase of the war began. The Economist quotes a study from summer 2021 which recorded 41% of Ukrainians agreeing with the idea that Ukraine and Russia are now one people. The figure is now 8%. The war has pushed the people further apart. Russia began a drive in Luhansk, which culminated in Ukrainian withdrawals from the towns of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk in June-July. However, these towns were destroyed in the process. The US provided new weapon systems to Ukraine, and from September, Ukraine won spectacular victories, first in Kharkiv and later retaking Kherson city. The US Army leadership believes Russia has suffered significantly over 100,000 casualties in Ukraine. It has lost at least 1,500 tanks, either destroyed or captured by Ukraine. Putin's aim of keeping NATO away from Russia's borders has backfired. Finland and Sweden, acting from justified fear of Putin's Russia, have applied for NATO membership. Germany set aside 100 billion euros to modernize and expand its armed forces, and Poland has increased arms spending to a massive 4% of GDP. However, the unwillingness of the West to provide aircraft, long-range missile systems, tanks and adequate amounts of the weapons it does give to Ukraine has handed the initiative back to Russia. Russia has mobilized and trained many tens of thousands of new troops, which it is now deploying. A new fourth phase of the war has begun with what appears to be increasingly violent assaults across much of the Donbass front line around Volodya and south of Zaporizhzhia. Putin shows no sign of ending his attacks on Ukraine, and his relentless war continues. Workers' Liberty believes Ukraine is right to fight to defend its self-determination from Russian imperialism and has the right to demand arms and aid from wherever it can get it. The Ukrainian left and trade unions, while still criticizing Zelensky and opposing his measures which restrict trade union rights, unanimously support Ukraine's war, knowing that a Russian victory will also mean the destruction of Ukraine's labor movement. Some of the British left disagree. The Morning Star, Socialist Worker and others argue that this war is, in fact, a war between Russia and NATO, with Ukraine acting as America's proxy. The West's war aim, apparently, is to defeat and seriously damage Russia. These radically disoriented left groups mangle reality to fit their political prejudices. They are Putin's useful idiots. This anti-war left demands an end to Western arms to Ukraine. They must know what this means: Ukrainian surrender and a Russian victory. If the US and European states really were acting to beat Russia down, it is inexplicable why they repeatedly stall and deny Ukraine the weapons it needs to defeat and force Russia out. The West did not want this war and is arming Ukraine to stop it losing, not to allow it to win. Part of it is that the West is scared of Putin's response if Ukraine does get the upper hand. They fear Putin might resort to chemical or nuclear weapons as a last result to protect himself from a loss in Ukraine, which would be a political disaster for his rule inside Russia. The US and European powers are alarmed by this war and most of all want it to end. Eventually they may well force Ukraine into a lousy deal with Putin in order to stop the war. The problem is that Putin does not want to stop, as his newly launched offensive proves. Defend Ukraine, back Ukraine's workers' movements. Emancipation, Class Struggle and Classism. Socialism versus Capitalism by Martin Thomas. Capitalist society generates and regenerates a class division between capitalists and workers, with at least one large intermediate class, the petty bourgeoisie, and many grey areas. Like many other societies, its course is shaped by class struggle. Victory by the working class in that class struggle will bring not a rearrangement, but the withering away of class divisions, not complete and uniform equality of everyone in every respect. Hard to imagine that would even look like, but removal of the class exploitation, domination and oppression that has blighted life under capitalism and for aeons before capitalism. So Marxists argue anyway. No one much denies the existence of class divisions, but many accuse Marxists of class reductionism, or define the problem not as classes but classism, prejudice against people of working class backgrounds. Marxists do not reduce all social issues to class, never have done. The Marxist movement, sometimes the socialist movement before Marx, has supported autonomous efforts with appropriate alliances for women's rights, LGBT plus rights, not then called that, national rights, anti-racism, broad civil liberties. On those issues, as indeed on more narrowly class issues, Marxists have often been inconsistent, wooden or even wrong, but only caricature can reduce the history of Marxism to class reductionism. Working class. The priority of working class struggle for Marxists is not a question of moral valuation or of thinking other forms of oppression negligible, but of the levers for change. Except under totalitarian regimes where all openings are blocked, the working class constantly generates permanent ongoing organisation and struggles, labour movements, as no previous suppressed class or group has. Since the Euro-communism of the 1970s and 80s, some hold up social movements as a more modern alternative to labour movements. But none of those cross-class social movements has had the breadth, durability and power of the labour movement. For the working class to augment its power, it needs to unite itself and to draw its worst-off sections into battle. Thus the logic of class struggle above a certain intensity is to generate and augment challenges to all oppressions. Socialism as an all-round alternative is possible only if the working class mobilise ourselves enough to become, in Marx's words, quotes, a class with radical change, a sphere which has a universal character by its universal suffering and claims no particular right because no particular wrong, but wrong generally is perpetuated against it, which cannot emancipate itself without thereby emancipation all other spheres of society. End quotes. Remedies to classism by seeking good regulations or enlightened administration so as to seek equal access to a ruling class or better off positions for people coming from working class backgrounds as sought by women, LGBT plus people, ethnic minorities, etc., are something much less. Page 3. Turning It Round for 15th to the 16th of March by Ali Moore. Coordinated strikes on 15th to 16th of March, which coincide with Budget Day, can help galvanise and intensify the ongoing strike wave. Teachers in the National Education Union, NEU, will strike on both days. Civil services servants in PCS will strike on the 15th of March. It is likely that RMT members on London Underground will strike on the 15th of March and on another day in the same week. Following RMT's rejection of the latest offers from employers in disputes on the National Rail, workers at Network Rail and mainline train operating companies may join them. The University and College Union's programme of strikes in universities currently includes 16th but not 15th of March, but many activists are pushing for the union to name further action. The Communication Workers Union is likely to renew its industrial action mandate in Royal Mail and can take action from the 2nd of March onwards, enabling them to join a mass strike on the 15th to the 16th of March. Coordinated. NHS unions involved in the strike wave have thus far been cooler about the prospect of coordination. The Royal College of Nursing, RCN, which has historically identified and functioned more as a professional association than a trade union, is cautious about identification with the wider labour movement and the possible politicisation of its dispute. But the RCN now looks likely to call its 48-hour strike on the 1st to the 3rd of March, with a reduction of derogations in A&E, intensive care and cancer units. There's surely potential to push for the RCN and other NHS unions to join coordinated strike days around 15th to 16th of March. There is no critical number of strikers which, when reached, tips a mass coordinated strike over into being a general strike. The form of the 1st of February strike, hopefully expanded on 15th to the 16th of March, is likely the closest thing to a general strike we will see in Britain any time soon. A general strike called as a special action by a single body would be mass defiance of anti-strike laws, a long way off for now. Pushing for unions with live strike mandates all to join action on the 15th to 16th of March is a better way of generalising and uniting the strikes than formulaic calls on the TUC or such to call a general strike. Stepping stone. Even the best mass coordinated strike on 15th to the 16th of March, however, can only be a stepping stone in an ongoing and escalating struggle, not a culmination. Each union must develop strategies for winning its own dispute, designed to maximise pressure on their particular employer. Given that government finances and funding stand behind those employers in most current disputes, either directly or indirectly, maximising coordination and seeking to unite the strikes into a class-wide fight back against the Tories will be to the benefit of all disputes. Unions must also seek ways to intensify the impact of their strikes. When disputes become entrenched and deadlocked, unions can either give up and accept defeat or find ways to increase pressure on employers. Continuing to repeat the same actions, striking sporadically for 24 to 48 hours at a time, will only lead to a dribbling away of morale. Strikers should be wary of union leaders dressing up such tactics as necessary for long-haul disputes. Drawn-out disputes suit bosses who can mostly live with low-impact levels of sporadic strikes for prolonged periods, much more than workers for whom they become a source of demoralisation that imparts the lesson that striking doesn't work. Rather, We should seek to end our disputes quickly on our terms by a level of action that can secure concessions. Concentrated. It took the Liverpool dockers 5 weeks concentrated action, about 30 days, to win. The Abellio bus workers 20 days to win the partial victory. Nothing less concentrated is likely to win in other sectors. Both RCN and NEU have recently called off strikes by their members in Wales after employers made offers which, although an improvement relative to previous ones, were still significantly below inflation. The RCN's formal demand is for a 19% pay rise. Suspending strikes for offers representing less than half that when the dispute is still gearing up only signals weakness. The Executive Committee of the Fire Brigades Union is also recommending its members accept a below-inflation offer, albeit one that significantly improves on the previous offer of 2%. See pages 14. Strike stands the greatest chance of victory if they are based on escalating action, building towards indefinite action where possible, supported by levies to bolster strike funds and hardship payments. Coordination on 15th to 16th of March must be a staging post on that path. Page 4. Oborne and the Trojan Horse Affair, Antidoto by Jim Denham. A previous column about the right-wing journalist Peter Oborne, Solidarity 661, described how this one-time conventional conservative had been transformed by the Iraq War into someone fated by sections of the left. I described his politics as right-wing isolationism. That column described Oborne's largely uncritical admiration of Islam and Islamic regimes, including some ultra-reactionary Islamists. I will now go on to examine Oborne's long-standing interest in the Birmingham Trojan Horse Affair, an alleged plot or campaign by some conservative Muslims to take over Birmingham secular state schools and turn them into de facto Islamic schools. Oborne was actively involved in the campaign to defend the schools and school leaders that had come under scrutiny. He continued to describe the entire affair as a hoax, and in his latest book, The Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam, claims, quotes, "The case for the Trojan horse plot now lies in ruins," end quotes. It was accepted by almost everyone from the outset in 2014 that the Trojan horse letter was a hoax in the sense that it was not what it purported to be. Advice from a Birmingham Muslim fundamentalist to a co-thinker in Bradford on how to take over schools. But a ruse to draw attention to what the creator of the letter believed was going on in certain Birmingham schools. That does not mean that claims of an Islamist campaign, or plot, call it what you will, were false. There is eyewitness evidence that at one school, Parkview, pupils were taught creationism and that a woman cannot refuse her husband's sex. At the same school, speakers with extreme Islamist and anti-Israel views were invited to address assemblies. Another school, Old Snow Academy in Small Heath, was found by Education Funding Authority inspectors to have been, quotes, taking on the practices of an Islamic faith school, end quotes, and had excluded non-Muslim staff and public from an annual trip paid for with public money to Saudi Arabia. Some of the truth finally emerged when one of the school leaders, dismissed for alleged misconduct, Roswan Faraz, brought a claim to an employment tribunal in 2018. ET case and decisions are in the public domain. Faraz was one of 5 people who had the cases against them dropped by the NCTL, National College for Teaching and Leadership disciplinary panel in 2017. Supporters of the 5, including Islamist organisations, the SWP, the Guardian's education editor Richard Adams and Oborne hailed the collapse of the case as vindication of their stance that the entire affair was a witch hunt based upon a forged document and fueled by Islamophobia. In fact, the collapse of the cases proved nothing of the sort. It was necessitated by legal technicality, important but a technicality nonetheless, resulting from the incompetence of the NCTL's lawyers who had failed to disclose evidence used as part of its prosecution. What the collapse didn't show was that the evidence against the five was untrue. So Razwan Feraz would have been well advised at that point to have quit while he was ahead, but Mr. Feraz insisted upon bringing a claim of religious discrimination and unfair dismissal against Birmingham Core Education Trust, who dismissed him from his job as deputy head of Nansen Primary School in 2015 at an employment tribunal. The tribunal published its decision and its reasoning. It found that Mr. Feraz was fairly dismissed because of comments he made on a WhatsApp group called Parkview Brotherhood, in which he described gay people as animals. He had written, quotes, "These animals are going out in full force. As teachers, we must be aware and counter their satanic ways of influencing young people," end quotes. Other comments posted on the WhatsApp group were viciously misogynistic and anti-Semitic. The employment judge, Richard Henderson, called Feraz's comments monstrously homophobic and described him as evasive and not a credible witness. This alone is sufficient to show that Oborne's dismissal of Trojan Horse as a fake media narrative that now lies in ruins is quite simply wrong. I will discuss Oborne on the Labour Party, anti-Semitism and Jeremy Corbyn in a future column. Arming Ukraine. Lessons from History by Eric Lee, founder-editor of Labour Start, writing here in a personal opinion column. Everyone knows that the only way to end the war in Ukraine, to really end it, is to ensure a Ukrainian military victory over the Russian aggressor. A decisive victory by the Ukrainians would almost certainly lead to the toppling of the Putin regime. The result would be a defanged Russia, one that poses far less of a threat to its neighbours. Everyone knows that Ukraine needs the latest tanks and aircraft to achieve that goal. The Russians have been hurling their basic weaponry at Ukrainian cities. Ukraine has been fighting back with what they have on hand, mostly Soviet-era tanks and planes. Everyone knows that, and yet NATO has been slow to arm Ukraine properly. For months, Germany has refused even to allow third countries such as Poland to re-export their Labour tanks. Now finally there have been some movements on this. But as President Zelensky pointed out in his recent whirlwind tour of European capitals, what Ukraine really needs now is fighter jets, and that for most NATO countries is a bridge too far. Poland's President Andrzej Duda, speaking to BBC's Laura Kunsberg, said sending 5-16 fighter jets would be a very serious decision that was not easy to take. In other words, he stepped back from the brink, and Poland was perhaps Ukraine's strongest ally in NATO. Why the reluctance? The Poles and others are worried that every time NATO supplies Ukraine with more weapons, they run the risk of Russia considering these to be an act of war. The Russians have already threatened to bomb NATO countries that provide Ukraine with advanced weaponry. So far, that has been a bluff. It may not remain a bluff forever. There is a history to this which Ukrainian leaders ignore at their peril. During the Spanish Civil War, Franco's forces were aided by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, who used the opportunity to test their latest weapons. The major Western democracies, including Britain, supported the ban on providing weapons to the Spanish Republic. The result was inevitable. The Republic was crushed, and Spain suffered 4 decades under Franco's dictatorship. In 1956, during the first major uprising against Soviet rule in an Eastern European country, the Hungarians overthrew the Stalinist regime that had been imposed upon them. The Soviet response was to invade the country. As Western powers, including the United States, had been encouraging the Hungarians to rebel against the Soviets, many Hungarians naively expected NATO to come to their rescue. There are stories of Hungarians standing on rooftops in Budapest, scanning the skies for signs of American aircraft. These planes never came. Thousands of brave Hungarians died, and many more fled the country. The Ukrainians have been cheered on by NATO and most of the world for an entire year now. Everywhere Zelensky goes, both in the real world and online, he's greeted as a hero. But as Ukraine faces an imminent and long-expected Russian counter-offensive, his big ask has been answered with a deafening silence. No one wants to rile the Russian bear, to provoke an increasingly deranged Putin to do something mad. So no one, not even the Poles, are in any hurry to give Ukraine the tools it needs to finish the job. Everyone knows that for the war to end, Ukraine must get the latest equipment, the best weapons that NATO can offer, including fighter jets. Without these, the Russians might turn their fortunes around, but NATO is hesitating. A year ago, the blue and yellow Ukrainian colours could be seen all over the Western world, including in the UK. Public support for Ukraine is undiminished. But now that support has to be transformed into mass campaigns involving thousands and demanding that governments do more than applaud Zelensky and the undoubted bravery of his people. Ukraine must not suffer the fate of Spain or Hungary. Socialists and trade unionists should march in the streets in the run-up to the anniversary of the Russian invasion, and on their banners and placards should be the clearest possible message: Arm Ukraine.